madhava kunja vihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parvajakacharya Astatara Sata Sri Srimada's Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai Anantakoti Vaishnavrinda Ki Jai ISKCON Founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Gauranga. Glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 28, Kapila's Instructions on Devotional Service. Text 36. Etayā, caramayā, manaso, nivṛttyā, tasmin, mahimny avasitaḥ, sukha-duḥkha-bāhye, hetutvam, asati, kartari, duḥkhayor, svātman, vidhatta, upalabdha-parātma-kāṣṭhaḥ. etayā caramayā manaso nivṛttyā. Tasmin mahimny avasitaḥ sukha-duḥkha-bāhye. hetutvam asati kartari duḥkhayor. svātman vidhatta upalabdha-parātma-kāṣṭhaḥ. etayā caramayā manaso nivṛttyā. tasmin mahimny avasitaḥ sukha-duḥkha-bāhye. hetutvam asati kartari duḥkhayor. svātman vidhatta upalabdha-parātma-kāṣṭhaḥ. So etayā caramayā manaso nivṛttyā. Mahimny avasitaḥ sukha-duḥkha-bāhye. duḥkhayor. Svātman vidhatta upalabdha-parātma-kāṣṭhaḥ. sva-ātman manaso nivṛttyā. Tasmin mahimny avasitaḥ sukha-duḥkha-bāhye. Vaishnavis, Saha, the yogi, api, moreover, etayā, by this, caramayā, ultimate, manasaḥ, of the mind, nivṛttyā, by cessation of material reaction, tasmin, in his, mahimni, ultimate glory, avasitaḥ, situated, sukha-duḥkha-bāhye, outside of happiness and distress, hetutvam, the cause, api, indeed, asati, a product of ignorance, kartari, in the false ego, duḥkhayoḥ, of pleasure and pain, yet which, sva-ātman, to his own self, vidhatte, he attributes, upalabdha, realized, para-ātma, of the personality of Godhead, kāṣṭhaḥ, the highest truth, Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Translation. Thus situated in the highest transcendental stage, the mind ceases from all material reaction and becomes situated in its own glory, transcendental to all material conceptions of happiness and distress. At that time, the yogi realizes the truth of his relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He discovers that pleasure and pain, as well as their interactions, which he attributed to his own self, are actually due to the false ego, which is a product of ignorance. Purport. Forgetfulness of one's relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a product of ignorance. By yoga practice, one can eradicate this ignorance of thinking oneself independent of the Supreme Lord. One's actual relationship is eternally that of love. The living entity is meant to render transcendental loving service to the Lord. Forgetfulness of that sweet relationship is called ignorance. And in ignorance, one is impelled by the three material modes of nature to think himself the enjoyer. When the devotee's mind is purified and he understands that his mind has to be dovetailed with the desires of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he has attained the perfectional transcendental stage, which is beyond the perception of material distress and happiness. So long as one acts on his own account, he is subject to all the material perceptions of so-called happiness and distress. Actually, there is no happiness. Just as there is no happiness in any of the activities of a madman, so in material activities, the mental concoctions of happiness and distress are false. Actually, everything is distress. When the mind is dovetailed to act according to the desire of the Lord, one has attained the transcendental stage. The desire to lord it over material nature is the cause of ignorance. And when that desire is completely extinguished, and the desires are dovetailed with those of the Supreme Lord, one has realized the perfectional stage, upalabdha-parātma-kāṣṭhaḥ. Upalabdha means realization. Realization necessarily indicates individuality. In the perfectional liberated stage, there is actual realization. Nivṛttyā means that the living entity keeps his individuality. Oneness means that he realizes happiness in the happiness of the Supreme Lord. In the Supreme Lord, there is nothing but happiness. Anandamaya vyasat. The Lord is by nature full of transcendental happiness. In the liberated stage, oneness with the Supreme Lord means that one has no realization other than happiness. But the individual still exists. Otherwise, this word upalabdha, indicating individual realization of transcendental happiness, would not have been used. Om Jnana-timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshur-militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasudhi Gaur Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So I was noting Srila Prabhupada's statement in the purport that actually this mental concoction of happiness and distress, the mental concoctions of happiness and distress are false. Actually, everything is distress. And that's kind of indicated in the synonyms that he gives. In the verse that speaks in line 2 about sukha-duḥkha-bāhye, that in his state, purified state, the soul is free of sukha and dukkha, outside of happiness and distress. And then in the third line, it says duḥkhayoḥ. It doesn't say sukha-duḥkhayoḥ, it just says duḥkhayoḥ. And Srila Prabhupada gives in his synonyms of pleasure and pain. Both of them are misery. So that's the nature of material happiness and distress. Sometimes Srila Prabhupada would use the phrase like wet stool or dry stool. Whatever it is, happiness and distress is like that. Just either the wet side or the dry side of some excrement. So that's a pretty harsh thing to realize, that what we consider to be pleasure or happiness is actually not. I mean, I'm speaking of material happiness. So actually it's all just distress, Srila Prabhupada says. And he indicates that it's just like the activities of a madman. Now sometimes this word madman is used in the Vedic scriptures and in Srila Prabhupada's rendition of them in a positive way to indicate that transcendental happiness as displayed by the pure devotees is sometimes mistaken as being like the activities of madman. But other times it's used in a more material sense as being actually the crazy activities of an actual madman. Sometimes on the streets in LA we encounter such people. At least I have. Sometimes they're screaming very loudly, shouting at someone or cursing something that you can't really see, or they are laughing madly. So all of that is actually distressful. So material happiness and distress are considered both to be just ultimately distress, in the sense that they are mental concoctions. They aren't part of the reality of the soul. Prakriti kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvasaha ahankara vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna explains that we think we're doing things and experiencing in reaction to it, good and bad results. We think that we're doing that. But actually, it's just a phantasmagoria generated by the three modes of material nature. And we identify with that falsely. Now that's a little difficult for some people to accept, that, not for just some people, for me, for anyone, to realize that we've made such a big mistake that we've identified with something that ultimately isn't real, that's just a facade. And people normally don't like to do that, to identify with some false thing, to have been deceived by some scam. You know, you think, oh God, why did I do that? You know, like, or the government, it's doing this and that. You know, and, or something, you get cheated by a relative or a spouse or something. You go, how could I have fallen for that? But we're all, in one sense, scamming ourselves by identifying with the material body and what we experience through it. We have to understand the material body is not just the gross physical body. There's also the subtle body of mind, intelligence, false ego. And if you really want to get deeply into it, the subtle senses, the subtle knowledge-acquiring senses, and the subtle working senses which operate through the physical machinery of the biological body. So, Krishna is stressing, and Srila Prabhupada is repeating in the purport, that the mind has to become purified. And then one can get free of the ignorance of this false ego, this false identification with this phantasmagoria that people consider their field of activities and their place of independent enjoyment. So the mind has to be controlled. Man manam vavamad bhakto, Krishna recommends in the Bhagavad Gita. Focus your mind on me and become my bhakta, become my devotee, render devotional service unto me. And then we begin to realize something. We have an eternal loving relationship with Krishna. And just as Krishna is Sat Chidananda Vigraha, his form is made of eternity, knowledge, and bliss, so we ourselves, being part and parcel of Krishna, Mamaivam so jiva loke, jiva bhuta sanatanaha, Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, you, O individual soul, he's speaking to Arjuna, you are my eternal fragmental part and parcel. Thus we're of the same substance as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but of less in quantity. Like a spark is the same substance of the fire, but it's smaller. So that's one point. But to get into this idea how the activities of a conditioned soul under the influence of false ego are compared to the activities of a madman, we can consider the verse Nunam pramate kurate vikarma yad indriya pritya apranoti nasadu manye yata atmano yamasanapi kleshada asa deha. This verse from the Srimad Bhagavatam means Nunam pramata. Pramata means mad. Kurute vikarma. So because people are mad in the sense that they have lost their conception of who they really are. To think that one is the body, that I am this body, and I am meant to enjoy material happiness by putting my material senses in contact with the material sense objects. Such a person, having forgotten their real identity, is certifiably, in the ultimate sense, not in their right state of mind, not in their right state of identification. And if you don't have a proper understanding of who you really are, then you can't act in your own best self-interest because you don't understand who the real self is. So, and then you do things that are not good for your ultimate self-interest. It's called vikarma. And why? Yad indriya pritiya aprinoti. Because one wants to please and satisfy the material senses with the material sense objects. And the highest pleasure for the materialist is usually some kind of sexual pleasure. And there are examples in the Vedic scriptures of such individuals who become bewildered by such things, like King Yayati. It's a long story, but he enjoyed himself very much in that way, but then he became older and wasn't able to enjoy. So he was told by a great sage that, well, if you like, I can give you a benediction that you can switch your old age with the youth of someone. So he had some sons, and he asked the first one, Yadu, the eldest son, said, okay, I can't enjoy anymore with this body. Can you exchange your youth for my body so I can continue to fulfill my desires? And Yadu said, well, no, I can't do that, because if I don't fulfill my desires, then I won't be able to renounce when I get older, as you're supposed to do under the Vedic system of life. One isn't supposed to engage in relationship with the opposite sex, for one's whole life. There should be some time set aside for renunciation and pure realization of the self and the super self. So that was actually considered to be a good reason not to do it, a bona fide reason to refuse the request, because it was ultimately for the purpose of increasing realization. But 3 other sons also refused, and their motives were not as pious as Yadu's. They simply wanted to, hey, I got to enjoy for as long as I can. Too bad. And then there was another son, Puru, who agreed to do it. So, eventually it worked out for everyone, but ultimately Yayati did become renounced and purified himself. But it's interesting, Yadu, because he had rejected his father's request for a good, spiritually bona fide reason, Krishna later appeared in his dynasty, the Yadu dynasty. So that's kind of interesting. But in the account in Srimad Bhagavatam, Yayati is at one point, when he's under this kind of illusion, he is described as behaving like a madman, pramata. So we don't want to remain in the pramata condition of life. And to facilitate that, Krishna provides instructions about how to live in this material world when we're still under the influence of false ego to some extent, still identifying with the material body, how the desires of the material body can be satisfied in such a way that one doesn't generate vikarma, that one can satisfy the material desires through following the regulative principles of dharmic life, and at the same time make spiritual progress. So the ultimate goal of that spiritual progress is being described in this verse, which is that one becomes completely transcendental to material happiness and distress. One becomes absorbed in transcendental happiness in relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Anandamaya Vyasat. That ultimately, the Supreme Lord is all about happiness, enjoyment, and as eternal servants of the Supreme Lord, we're meant to experience the same. So I'll stop there. I'll just mention that today is Bhishma's appearance day. So he was a great personality mentioned in many places in the Srimad Bhagavatam and Mahabharata. He was the son of King Shantanu, and there are many things that could be said about him. Although he was a devotee of the Supreme Lord for different reasons, he took the side of the Kuru dynasty in the battle of Kurukshetra. And Krishna had promised not to become directly involved in the fighting. He said he wouldn't take up any weapons and fight on the side of Arjuna. But in the battle, Bhishma was on the verge of defeating Arjuna, and Arjuna's chariot had broken down, and Krishna took up the wheel of the chariot to stop Bhishma from killing Arjuna with his many weapons. And for that reason, it's a very famous pastime. I think you have a painting of it in your office. So if you had the privilege of going into Srivastava's office, you've seen that painting of Krishna rushing towards Bhishma. And then in the end, of course, the Pandavas won the battle. Bhishma wound up on the verge of leaving his body, lying on a bed of arrows, it stated, and in that condition, he gave very valuable instructions in Krishna consciousness to Yudhisthira and the assembled personalities. So we can remember him today. Any comment or question? Yes? Brigupati?
Thank you for the class, Prabhu. Sometimes a person who's intoxicated, they're drinking too much alcohol, they don't think they're intoxicated. They are, and other people can see that. People who are sober can see that, but they themselves, they don't realize they're intoxicated. So is that the way we can understand how people in the material world, they think they're happy? And it's like when I go on a college campus, I'll see a young boy, young girl, very good looking, maybe holding hands. They're obviously a couple. And if I try to tell them, actually you're suffering, it's kind of like, what? They'll think I'm crazy. So what's the way to understand that?
Well, we have to become connoisseurs of different types of pleasures. Sometimes, in the world you see people go on wine tasting tours. So you have to be able to distinguish between, the different types of pleasures that are available. And some of them, so it requires some education, how to distinguish between material happiness and spiritual happiness. And it's possible, if someone is interested in that type of happiness, it's possible to experience it in such a way that both the participants remain happy and satisfied. These days I've read and heard, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, that people aren't getting into stable relationships as often as they did in the past in terms of marriage and having children and things like that. So something appears to be unsettling the minds of people.
You think it's self-realization or just an increase in the mode of ignorance?
I'd have to look at each individual case in depth. Because like Srila Prabhupada, he observed the same thing that you observed, but he said, it's all right, but just get married, stick to one, and be responsible. And you can have that. You can satisfy, there is a way to satisfy one's material desires in the most efficient way possible so that one experiences that, is satisfied with it, and makes progress towards achieving a higher pleasure. Savas?
This thing of happiness, could you just expound a little bit on what a devotee should be thinking about happiness? Just like if an everyday normal devotee, if they want to be happy in Krishna consciousness, could you tell us what that means?
Probably demonstrating it would be better than telling it. But I think one has to have some experience of the higher pleasure. Paramjasva nivṛttyā, Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, experiencing a higher taste, one automatically gives up lower things. If you're not experiencing the higher taste, there's no use in trying to artificially renounce things. So the devotees somehow or other have experienced a bit of that higher taste. Maybe they're not experiencing the higher taste at every single moment, but they've experienced it enough that they're able to commit themselves to a spiritual discipline, the practice of bhakti yoga and the association of devotees. And where do you get that higher taste? For some, it's the prasadam. For some, it's the association of devotees or a particular devotee. And you compare. That's what an intelligent person does, compares all the options and think, okay, well, I'd rather hang out with these people than those people. Or I would rather be in the temple than at the rock concert or the baseball game. I would rather read this book than the news about the politics that's going on in this country. It's a comparative thing. At least that was my experience. I would compare the experience I got when I was visiting a little preaching center that a devotee had set up in Albany, New York. I was living in New York State at that time. And I would just compare the experiences. Decide, well, yeah, I really dig that. I really like that. Let me go there. Or listening to the Radha Krishna Temple album. I like that better than the Rolling Stones. I like it better. Or food. I like that better than McDonald's fast food burger or whatever. Or I like talking with this person better than I like talking with other people. They're fine, they're my friends and all, but there's something missing, something extra that I'm getting out of this. And then you want to, well, how can I be experiencing more of that? And that might give you the impetus to take up the practices of bhakti yoga.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to force yourself to admit you're happy performing devotional service. Because we can be the greatest skeptics. Sometimes I just have to admit myself. It's almost like I have to twist my arm, say, you're happy, admit it. But everyone has their free will. At any moment, you can decide to do something else. Nobody's going to stop you or stop at us. It's if I wasn't, to some extent, experiencing some higher taste or happiness, I wouldn't be here. So I think we're all in that same position. Nobody's locked the doors. It's not you come in here, the doors are locked, you can't go, the exits are there.
Yeah.
Sri Prabhupada ki jai.
Who maintains those?
Oh, we got a whole team. We got a greenhouse of probably like 40 tulsis.
Oh, sorry, I wanted to see how many she is.
About to be. How many tulsis do you think are in there? 7.
What